All right, so today we are going to talk about Florentine politics, just one slide, a little bit of the Medici's, and then we are going to talk about Niccolo Machiavelli. So, Florentine politics again. The Medici's were the ones who were ruling the day. One of them actually even becomes pope. I know I told you guys that. Also, they they become the powerful family within within Florence, and really a powerful family within Italy. So when we look at Florentine politics, we talked about again how the Medici's controlled Florence for nearly 3 centuries. You're looking at 300 years of just one family. Their vast wealth, palaces were built. They had a strong army. They were involved or controlled most of the aspects of life in the city. They also constantly kept watch for enemies who plotted against the family. Lorenzo the Magnificent is one of the most famous members, most powerful, leading patron of art and scholarship. Lorenzo ruled Florence for more than 20 years until his death in 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. 2 years later, a revolution forced the Medici to temporary exile, and then 1512, the family regained their power. So the Medicis are the number one family within Florence, and the number one family was that was a patron of the arts and helped the Renaissance continue to spread. So now we get to this guy, Niccolo Machiavelli. All right, he is widely read by a lot of people, especially people who are politicians, political minds, constitutional scholars, all of those types of people. He really has some outlandish ideas. And if we were in class, we would actually have taken like a little survey on this to see if you believed in what Niccolo Machiavelli was talking about, and how he believed politics and government should work. So when we look at Machiavelli, he was a guy from Florence again, and he watched the struggle for power between the people and the Medicis and a bunch of different aspects. During the Medici's exile, he actually reorganizes the city's defenses. He also served as a diplomat and spent time observing the actions of a bunch of other Italian rulers. So he was really interested in politics. I know some of you guys are doing Machiavelli because I saw that you guys were doing it. He used his experience to write the book called The Prince. The book is an account of how politics and government, in his mind, really work. And he talks about how he advises rulers in this book to make their state strong by doing what works best rather than by doing what is good or moral. So, when you really think about it, all right, if you are a leader, dictator, however you want to look at it, and what works best for you is the fact that you need to, I don't know, have mandatory military work. So everybody that's a man has to spend 4 years in the military, serving in the military between the ages of 18 and 30. We'll put it that way. So you have to have 4 years. Doesn't matter if you do it at 18. Doesn't matter if you do it at 28. Whenever. You've got to have 4 years of mandatory military service, because this is what works best for your country. Is that good and moral for everybody, or for probably the most of the people? No. Okay. And he even goes on to say that he said that they should even lie if it helps them to rule. You should tell lies. He is advising people who are in political positions to tell lies because it will help them rule. When you really look around, we have this fake news movement. We've seen in history of government uh, and politics how they how world leaders uh, choose to say certain things and choose not to say certain things. And they're trying to keep information from the people, basically, because if all of the total information would get out, it might look bad on them. Excuse me. So you still see this now. In his view, the end or purpose justifies the means. So the actions taken to achieve that purpose gets you to where you need to be. So if, like I said, if you need to have conscription, mandatory conscription, where all men have to be part of the military, and the purpose of this gets you to the end and it's justified, let's say by, I don't know, winning more territory or something like that, you're really looking at a, you know, a Machiavellian type of idea. Rulers, he wrote, should also be feared rather than loved. And that was where, if we were in class, we would be talking about this a little bit more, and I would want to see what your ideas were on that aspect of, you know, feared rather than loved. Um, is a ruler a good ruler because they're feared, or is the ruler a good ruler because they're loved? And what arguments could you put together for that aspect? So what is interesting about this is that Machiavelli pretty much contradicts humanist ideas about people's goodness. Most humanists thought that people were normally good. They had good intentions, but he kind of brings this realism back to the people, uh, that just really people didn't want to see. Uh, they wanted to believe, that the higher ups wanted to believe humanism, that people were good. But this realism shocked a lot of people. But in other ways, the book really shows the influence of humanist ideas, though. It's the product of one individual's careful observation and thinking. How did Da Vinci get to that point of flight and the thought process of flight? He just viewed and he watched and he determined how it would go, or how he thought it would go. Machiavelli did the same thing. He was just viewing politics and he was writing down the realistic aspects of politics during this time, which really kind of resonates to what we have today. It is the product of it is concerned with how things really work in the world. It also separates ideas about government from ideas about religion. In this respect, what the Prince is really truly a very modern work. It's really interesting. Like I said, if we were in class, I would have you guys read some of this, a little excerpt of it. But it's really interesting to see this stuff and to see that this guy, way back, when Columbus was sailing the ocean blue, um, was writing about the realism of politics, and it still resonates to what we have today with political leaders that we have within our world. So the last thing we'll look at is a little bit of what is a Machiavellian. Okay.
From Shakespeare's plays to modern TV dramas, the unscrupulous schemer for whom the ends always justify the means has become a familiar character type we love to hate. So familiar, in fact, that for centuries we've had a single word to describe such characters: Machiavellian. But is it possible that we've been using that word wrong this whole time? The early 16th century statesman Niccolo Machiavelli wrote many works of history, philosophy, and drama, but his lasting notoriety comes from a brief political essay known as The Prince, framed as advice to current and future monarchs. Machiavelli wasn't the first to do this. In fact, there was an entire tradition of works known as mirrors for princes, going back to antiquity. But unlike his predecessors, Machiavelli didn't try to describe an ideal government or exhort his audience to rule justly and virtuously. Instead, he focused on the question of power, how to acquire it, and how to keep it. And in the decades after it was published, The Prince gained a diabolical reputation. During the European Wars of Religion, both Catholics and Protestants blamed Machiavelli for inspiring acts of violence and tyranny committed by their opponents. By the end of the century, Shakespeare was using Machiavel to denote an amoral opportunist, leading directly to our popular use of Machiavellian as a synonym for manipulative villainy. At first glance, The Prince's reputation as a manual for tyranny seems well-deserved. Throughout, Machiavelli appears entirely unconcerned with morality, except insofar as it's helpful or harmful to maintaining power. For instance, princes are told to consider all the atrocities necessary to seize power, and to commit them in a single stroke to ensure future stability. Attacking neighboring territories and oppressing religious minorities are mentioned as effective ways of occupying the public. Regarding a prince's personal behavior, Machiavelli advises keeping up the appearance of virtues such as honesty or generosity, but being ready to abandon them as soon as one's interests are threatened. Most famously, he notes that for a ruler, it is much safer to be feared than loved. The tract even ends with an appeal to Lorenzo de' Medici, the recently installed ruler of Florence, urging him to unite the fragmented city-states of Italy under his rule. Many have justified Machiavelli as motivated by unsentimental realism and a desire for peace in an Italy torn by internal and external conflict. According to this view, Machiavelli was the first to understand a difficult truth. The greater good of political stability is worth whatever unsavory tactics are needed to attain it. The philosopher Isaiah Berlin suggested that rather than being amoral, The Prince harkens back to ancient Greek morality, placing the glory of the state above the Christian ideal of individual salvation. But what we know about Machiavelli might not fit this picture. The author had served in his native Florence for 14 years as a diplomat, staunchly defending its elected Republican government against would-be monarchs. When the Medici family seized power, he not only lost his position, but was even tortured and banished. With this in mind, it's possible to read the pamphlet he wrote from exile not as a defense of princely rule, but a scathing description of how it operates. Indeed, Enlightenment figures, like Spinoza, saw it as warning free citizens of the various ways in which they can be subjugated by aspiring rulers. In fact, both readings might be true. Machiavelli may have written a manual for tyrannical rulers, but by sharing it, he also revealed the cards to those who would be ruled. In doing so, he revolutionized political philosophy, laying the foundations for Hobbes and future thinkers to study human affairs based on their concrete realities rather than preconceived ideals. Through his brutal and shocking honesty, Machiavelli sought to shatter popular delusions about what power really entails. And as he wrote to a friend shortly before his death, he hoped that people would learn the way to hell in order to flee from it. For another famous take on power dynamics.
So Machiavelli is a very interesting guy. I mean, one of his last writings you saw was that he wrote to his friend that people would learn their way to get to hell so they could flee the aspect of going to hell. It's kind of like a play on words there, but what he's really saying is if people know what they're doing wrong, maybe to get to hell, then they might actually not be doing those things anymore. So Machiavelli, A very interesting thinker during that time. Tomorrow, let's see what we got left. We'll be close to being done. I'll go over the spread of the Renaissance, why it ended, and then finish up. So remember, get your stuff in so I can get that into the grade book. Thanks.